It's Christmas, the most wonderful time of the year. There's a Christmas spirit in the air, and it comes accompanied by Christmas music and Christmas food and, well, hustle and bustle and family and football and all the festivities, all those things that we've come to know and love that make Christmas what it is. And then, of course, there are the gifts. Who among us doesn't like giving and receiving gifts? I mean, there's something that resonates within us when we give something special to someone who is special. And it makes us feel good when they do the same for us. And Christmas is the most gift-giving season of the entire year, which of course makes Christmas big business. Many merchants in our culture tell us that Christmas is the make or break season for the entire year, financially speaking. You know, with all the attention on all the gifts, all the things, we call that materialism. Christmas also has a downside. For millions of individuals and families spend too much money on too many gifts and actually go into debt every Christmas. That's not a good thing. And what about the generations of children that we've told all the fanciful stories about Santa Claus to? And while that might have started out as innocent fun, I'm afraid there are millions of people in our culture who have no idea that there's a historic event behind this entire Christmas scene. If we've lost Christmas in this culture, I'd like to find it. And I'd like to invite you to come along with me on a search for Christmas. We're going to go back to the lands of the Bible. We're going to go to Bethlehem. We're going to see where Mary and Joseph came because of that census that Rome had decreed. And I'd like to show you a shepherd's cave. It's there in a place that's just unspeakable to think about having a baby. It's there where Jesus was born. But did you know there's actually more to the Christmas story than simply the baby in the manger? That there's a message about materialism right in the first line of the Christmas story? Matthew tried to tell us this. He said, in the time of King Herod, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Now we're 2,000 years removed from King Herod. Our culture is different from the culture Jesus knew. But King Herod is the key. For you see, he might have been the world's wealthiest man. And without a doubt, he had built his largest and most elaborate palace just outside Bethlehem. Amazing as it sounds, Jesus was born in the shadow of what might have been the world's largest palace. So come with me. Let's search for Christmas together. What we find there, it might change more than simply the season of the year. What we find there on our search for Christmas might change everything. We're in Bethlehem, one of the most famous cities in all the world. Come to this manger square on Christmas Eve and you'll find thousands of people packed in here celebrating the birth of Jesus. For the Bible tells us that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. There's an old church that stands over the traditional spot of where Jesus was born. It's a little hard to see in there that there was originally a cave and it was just the minimal of shelter. But you can understand perhaps why Joseph was so desperate to find a place for his wife to stay. She was in labor, that they were in a crowded place. But you know, we're not going to tell the story of Christmas only in Bethlehem. We're going to travel some. We're going to take the ancient past to find out the complete background of Christmas. Why would we go to Nazareth, for instance? Well, that's where Mary and Joseph were when this whole thing started. But we're going to go even further than that. We're going to go into Jordan. Because the background of Christmas is built around the life of even another man who was growing up there, the lessons he would learn as a boy, long before Jesus was born, would develop a lifestyle philosophy that would have a profound impact on the Christmas story 2,000 years ago and Christmas today. To understand the contrast of the Christmas story, the difference between Herod and Jesus, one only needs to take a short walk southeast of Bethlehem. There you will find the ruins of the Herodium, the foundation of a mountain fortress that might have been the world's largest palace. Now, it was only one of King Herod's palaces that were scattered throughout Israel, but it was his favorite. He chose it as his burial place. In 2007, that burial place was finally discovered. When Jesus was born, Herod's palace here dominated the landscape around Bethlehem. It was topped with towers. It was filled with luxury. From the gigantic swimming pool at the base of this palace to the elaborate structure on the inside of the man-made mountain, it's hard to believe one man's money and power built it all. To find out more about the Herodium, we enlisted the help of Boaz Shalgi. He's the founder of Experience Destination Israel and an expert on the ancient sites of Israel.
This is one of Herod's desert palaces. Herod wanted to leave a legacy. Herod wanted people to admire him thousands of years after he's gone. And this is one of his marks that he left in the desert. Huge monument standing here for 2,000 years. And this is also why I'm assuming he chose this spot to also be his burial place.
How many people could stay in this thing? This is larger than can actually be described. I mean, how many people would Herod have had here?
Hundreds of people. Hundreds of people to just maintain the place. The synagogue that is there, and the bathhouses that are there, and the watchtowers, and the regular maintenance will require hundreds of people on a regular basis.
It's almost unspeakable how much money Herod would have had. This is very ironic that it's right outside of the place where Jesus was born, with parents so poor they couldn't even afford a place to stay, even when Mary was delivering a child.
That's a good point. The man that was probably the wealthiest man ever lived, with all the wealth in the world, over here, and only a few kilometers from here, Mary and Joseph, as you just said, people who were poor and basically had nothing comparing to him.
When Jesus was born, Herod was at the end of his life. It was Herod's sons that Jesus would know as an adult, but they were all cut from the same cloth as their father. The money they had, it was family money. For the family of Herod was one of the wealthiest families in world history. There's a place where we can still glimpse some of this wealth and to understand the power this family had. But to see it, we're going to have to cross the border into nearby Jordan. For if you'd like to see the lifestyle of the rich and famous in the ancient world, the lifestyle of Herod's family, you've got to visit the rock city of Petra. Well, we've come a long ways to find the very beginning of the Christmas story. The deepest part of the background of the story is set up in that simple little sentence. Matthew tells us, in the time of Herod, Jesus was born. I think to understand the Christmas story in its fullest, then we have to understand where Herod came from. And if you want to take Herod back to his childhood, I think you have to go to Petra. You see, Herod's father was a Edomite, and his mother was a Nabatean. Now, the capital of the Nabatean Empire is here in Petra. History tells us that in 65 BCE, Herod's father sent his children here for safety reasons. If Herod indeed was one of those children, then we can say with pretty close certainty he spent some growing up time here. You know, you get used to what home is when you're a child. Whether you grow up in suburban America or maybe the jungles of Africa or maybe some land in Asia. You get used to what home should look like and what the norm is for your family's economy. Think of the impact this has. Herod grew up in what you might call the world's wealthiest neighborhood. It says that if you need to cut a house right out of the rock, well, that's what you do. If you want to build a palace and a fortress in an impossible place, well, you just get it done. It looks to me like Herod came into his adult life, into that career as being king of all Judea with a lifestyle philosophy that says, I deserve it all, I want it all, and if people have to serve me, then that's what will happen. That's the norm. And if you go around Israel, you look at what Herod built, you look at the evidence of the money he had. Apparently he got it. He got it all. You spend some time hiking around this place, you'll find out that Petra is an extremely large place. In fact, the archaeological park that houses the ruins today covers 165 square miles. And you know what? From the theater to the civic buildings to the housing to the grandeur of the tombs, it's obvious. Every square inch was dedicated to excellence. Once you've seen Petra, it's a little easier to understand why Herod would build such elaborate palaces out of rock all over Israel. In a sense, he built models of Petra throughout his kingdom. Herod added palaces in Sebasti, Machaerus, Jericho, Jerusalem, and of course, near Bethlehem with the Herodium. At Caesarea, for instance, Herod built both a palace and a new city to go with his new home on the Mediterranean. He even added a man-made port at Caesarea that brought ships for the first time from around the Roman Empire straight to Israel. But the most famous of Herod's desert palaces was the rock fortress of Masada. When Herod became king of all Judea, when he began to earn the reputation as a man called Herod the Great, he earned it because he built palaces, he built fortresses all over Israel. In fact, they extended beyond Israel's border. But down in the desert, here next to the Dead Sea, the most famous of all those palaces was Masada. It's called a rock fortress, and it's called a rock fortress for a good reason. But not only was this a military stronghold, a safe place for Herod to hide, this was a resort. Here in the middle of the desert, where there is no fresh water, Herod had swimming pools, he had a spa, he had a palace on the north end, he had a palace on the south end. Even today, 2,000 years later, it's not hard to see how wealthy Herod was. If you want to see how this man dominated the national economy, what it means that he was here and that Jesus was born in the time of King Herod, a trip to the top of Masada is a necessity. It's there you can see the power. It's quite the hike to the top of Masada when you're not carrying anything at all. Now imagine a construction project that required all of the building materials to first be hauled 450 meters to the top of the mountain. That's the equivalent of 5 football fields high. So people have trouble remembering that it wasn't rock, it was all plaster. You can see the plaster up there. You know, sometimes it's hard to see through all the ruins what once was here. But at Masada, even some of the wall covering, very colorful, still remains after 2,000 years. Now imagine this entire mountain fortress covered with not only plaster, but luxurious wall coverings. It's wall-to-wall luxury on top of a mountain in the middle of nowhere. It's absolutely stunning how much money Herod had and how many of these palaces he had. When you visit Masada, you're going to see something that is very typical of all the palaces Herod built. Whether he was on the Mediterranean at Caesarea, or in Jericho, or at Jerusalem, or in the Herodium, and in some of the other palaces he had, he never simply built a place to live. He built wall-to-wall luxury. He built to impress. He wanted Rome to be talking about the palaces he had here. The short end of the story, Herod lacked for nothing. He was a man who had everything. He wanted it all, and he got it all. When one man had it all, of course, that meant that almost everyone else had almost nothing at all. When the story of Christmas unfolded, when the most important birth in history would take place, it would not come in one of the royal homes of Herod or any other home of great luxury. Instead, the one called the Son of God would be born to a poverty-stricken young couple in an extremely poor village. When the angels finally came to earth to announce the coming Christ child, the coming Christmas, they were sent to a place called Nazareth. That's far away from Herod's money and power, and it's far to the north of Masada in the fertile farmland of the Galilee region. If you're going to take the ancient past through Israel and look for Christmas, well, obviously, you have to come to Nazareth, because the Bible tells us this is where Mary was and where Joseph lived. The angel came here to announce to them both that it was time for the Christ to be born. And Jesus grew up in Nazareth. And there's a beautiful church right in the heart of this large city that marks the place where all of that took place. It's hard to visualize a community of, say, 200 people in a city as large as this. There must be somewhere between 50 and 75,000 people living in Nazareth today. But thankfully, there's a new village that's been built, a new village that's actually an old village. And it helps us visualize what life was like 2,000 years ago. Amir Nicola, the research manager at the Nazareth Village, took us on a walk back into time. In the heart of modern-day Nazareth, Amir and his staff have created a remarkable model of ancient Nazareth, the village Mary, Joseph, and Jesus would have known as home. And Amir told me something else. The reason Mary and Joseph had to go all the way to Bethlehem for the census was that most of the people in tiny Nazareth had only recently moved from Bethlehem to the Galilee region.
It's about 400 to 500 people lived in Nazareth, according to the scholars. And these people came originally from Bethlehem, moved to the north here about 100 years before Jesus' birth in order to establish a place here to try to control the whole Galilee back from the Greeks. By the way, that explains why Joseph had to travel back to Bethlehem with Mary, the city of his ancestors, to register. And then we know the nativity story, what happened.
The contrast between Nazareth and Masada, or Nazareth and Petra, could not be more stark. And yet it was here in Nazareth where God first unveiled the news to Mary and then to Joseph that they had been chosen for the most important job of parenting in history. When Mary accepted the task of carrying the child, she also accepted the scandal that came with the job. She and Joseph were not yet married, but she was pregnant. Not even Joseph believed her story of a miraculous conception until he himself had been granted a miraculous visit from an angel. Mary left immediately to spend a few months with her relative, who lived just outside of Jerusalem, some 75 miles away. And then she returned to Nazareth. Mary was soon in no condition to travel again, but a census ordered by Rome meant that she and Joseph were about to head south, pregnancy or not. So from this very small place, this common village called Nazareth, Mary and Joseph got ready to go to Bethlehem. It was a long journey. They had made it many times with their families. Mary had already made the journey once during the pregnancy, but now she was close to full term. She was close to that 9-month mark. It must have been the hardest journey of their lives. But this is the way the prophets had said it would happen. Though Jesus would be called a Nazarene, the Christ child must be born in Bethlehem. It's a long journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and it would have taken several days for Mary and Joseph to have walked the road that ran parallel to the Jordan River until they finally arrived in Jericho. From there, they were only 20 or so miles from the finish of their journey. But that last stretch of travel included some of the most difficult hiking in all of Israel. It's a wonder they were able to make the trip at all. We know from the Bible's record that Joseph was desperate to find a place for Mary to rest by the time they reached Bethlehem. Considering the strenuous nature of the hiking, it's possible that the reason he was so desperate was that Mary was already in labor by the time they arrived. But with every room taken in every home, Joseph soon had to settle on the most basic kind of shelter. He and Mary would rest in a cave, and it was there that Mary would give birth to Jesus. Well, we've come back to Bethlehem, come full circle. You know, there are 38,000 people who live here today. That's a large place. In fact, if you were to go into the surrounding area of Bethlehem, you're talking about 100,000 plus. When Mary and Joseph came here, it was a small village. And they couldn't find anywhere to stay, the Bible tells us. And so they eventually settled, because they were so desperate for a place to stay, on nothing more than a shepherd's cave, a place where they could simply get out of the elements. And it was there, of all places, that the most important birth in history took place. Even with the urban sprawl of modern-day Bethlehem, it's still possible to find a few shepherds' caves out on the rugged landscape of the Judean mountain ridge. We took a short hike east of Bethlehem and soon found shepherds, their sheep, and indeed a shepherd's cave. Even today, the shepherds' fields are still in the shadow of the ruins of the Herodium. 2,000 years ago, the great palace set the stage for one of history's greatest ironies. For in the shadow of what might have been the world's largest palace, built by what might have been the world's wealthiest man, a new king was born among the lambs of Bethlehem. So this is Christmas. Doesn't feel like Christmas. And I suppose after centuries of shepherds taking their sheep inside such a place, when Mary and Joseph visited a cave somewhere near this area 2,000 years ago, it probably didn't smell like Christmas. What an environment to take a family. What a horrible environment to prepare for the birth of a child. And yet it was in a place like this where Jesus was born. That's incomprehensible as simply a human being to think of any child being born in a cave. And yet this was no ordinary child. It was God's child. Why would God allow His Son to be born in such a place as this? Well, consider the statement being made to the world by this particular entrance. There's no door. There are no guards protecting people, separating people from God's Son. He's open to the world. Anyone can come in. The shepherds had no trouble finding this place, and they had no blocks from coming in and worshiping the Christ child. Perhaps the people of Bethlehem came in too. When the Magi visit, the next time we hear of Mary and Joseph in Bethlehem, Matthew tells us they were in a home. They didn't stay in this environment very long. Perhaps some of the women took pity on Mary and her newborn and moved her quickly. I think maybe that's why God chose such a place, to let us know that this is an invitation for anyone to come in. There's a parallel of two lives in the Christmas story. I guess Matthew's been trying to tell us that all along. After all, he begins the Christmas story with the phrase, "In the time of King Herod, in Judea, in Bethlehem, Jesus was born." Right off the bat, there it is. Herod or Jesus. Take your pick. You see, Herod's presence dominated this area with power and wealth. He lived his life one generation before Jesus was born. Just as Herod died, Jesus was born, somewhere around here near Bethlehem. In fact, right near here, just over the hill, is the Herodium, the ruins of the Herodium, the ruins of what might have been Herod's largest palace. What a contradiction in two different lives. Herod wanted it all. Herod got it all. He had an army at his disposal. He mistreated his family. He had more wealth, perhaps, than the rest of the country combined. Jesus came along. He loved his family. He loved his friends. He loved his enemies. Yet he never had an army. He never owned anything. In fact, it seemed that while Herod wanted to get it all, Jesus was intent on giving it all. I mean, his whole life was about giving himself away. And then he simply asked people to follow him, to model him. That's how you know a follower of Jesus, not by tradition, not by some kind of ritual, but whether or not they're simply following him. In fact, if you had walked these lands 2,000 years ago and asked people, "Where's the king?" Well, they would have pointed to the Herodium, I suppose, and told you all about Herod. But come back 2,000 years, all you can see of Herod are the ruins of the buildings he built, the stories of how cruel he was. Jesus, well, for the last 2,000 years, people have been changing their lives because of him, because of what he said, because of what he did. You think of all the hospitals and churches and orphanages. People have been continually giving themselves away ever since Jesus lived his life, and it all started here in Bethlehem. You know, we've been following the ancient past throughout Israel, looking for the truth of this story, trying to understand it in a deeper way, in a fuller way. You don't have to come to Israel to chase down the ancient path. What did the old prophet say? Ask for the ancient path, ask for the good way, and walk in it, and you will find peace for your souls. Jesus offered that peace. And if you want to walk the ancient path, it's not about coming here necessarily. It's about the way you live your life. Would you like to know who the King is in your own life? Well, just look at the path that you're traveling, and you'll find the answer. That's an amazing story, isn't it? And to think about it, it was there all along. Matthew said very plainly, first sentence of the Christmas story, in the time of King Herod, Jesus was born. And there you have it, the contrast of two personalities, Herod and Jesus. Herod, he wanted it all, he got it all. As a matter of fact, he took it all. Jesus, he didn't seem to want anything. He owned almost nothing. And he gave away everything, including his life. Herod was cruel to everyone he met. He went down in history as one of the meanest people who ever lived. Jesus was all about love. He loved his family, he loved his friends. He treated his enemies as if they were family. You know what's ironic? We've created a Christmas holiday in our culture that seems to have reversed all of this. I think Herod would love a modern day Christmas, and I'm not sure Jesus would recognize it. Now here's what I'd like to do. I want to keep the family traditions, and I want you to keep your family traditions. The gift giving is a wonderful way to honor Jesus. After all, God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. I mean, the whole thing is a gift. So let's keep the gifts. Let's just make sure as we give the gifts, as we celebrate the holiday, that we honor the right King. Jesus asked us to follow Him. One of the writers in the Bible, one of His followers, said it this way: anyone who claims to be in Him must walk as Jesus walked, must live as Jesus lived. So that means, since Jesus was generous, I want to be generous. He was selfless, I want to be selfless. He served others, I want to serve others. He gave Himself away, I want to give myself away. And I hope you do too. This is what it means to follow Jesus. This is what it means to follow Him as King, as Lord of your life. We went on a search for Christmas, and I hope you discovered something new. But I hope you discovered more than that. Because if you can find the right King and follow Him all of your life, you'll find meaning, joy, and purpose, that fulfillment. Jesus said it's an abundant life. What a gift of Christmas. That gift, my friend, will last a lifetime.